So, coming back to P66 and the Gospel of John, in particular, we're going to be looking. I ended last time at John 1:14. I want to pick up at John 1:18, just because I think there are a number of things that I would like to discuss just academically and devotionally within this passage. So, right there, the text is Theon, Udes, Uroken, Popete, Monogenes, Theos, Ha Hon, Eis Ton, Kalpon, Tu Patros, Ekenos, Exegesato. Once again, Theon, Udes, Euroken, Popete, Monogenes Theos, Ha Hon, Eis Ton, Kalpon, Ton Patros, Ekenos, Exegesato. Right there, you see no one. Now that's your nominative subject. And then ever, there's your adverb, has seen, and your direct object over at the front, theon, in the accusative form, God. So no one has ever seen God. Now, this next clause is why I wanted to do this particular verse from this particular text, because here we have some textual issues and some debated issues. So first is the question of the Greek. Should we read this as monogenes theos, the one and only God, or do we read the Byzantine or majority reading of homogenes huios, the one and only Son? And at the top of that, we have to ask another question, not just whether John originally wrote theos or huios, but on top of that, there's a debate as to what exactly monogenes means to begin with. Should it be rendered as only begotten, which you'll see in, say, the KJV, or one and only? And I'm going to show my cards a little bit on this last question, because if we keep going in P66 here, we see the one and only God, the one being in the bosom of the Father, and that phrase, eis ton kalpon, is somewhat of an idiom. It means at the side or in closest communion with. That one has exegesato, has made him known or explained him. Now, let me come back to exegesato in a moment, because I want to talk about the significance of that. Let's go back, though, to the issue of monogenes theos. So, the New English Translation, the NET, has a good breakdown of this issue in its footnotes. I do a small group at my house on Wednesday evening with a number of individuals at my church, and all of the people who attend my small group are very familiar with the NET, the Net Bible, because while it's not my primary translation, I don't love every choice of the translation. I'm always consulting it for reference because its footnotes are exhaustive. And the NET there at this particular passage, John 1:18, outlines the issue well. So if you're curious, you can hop on Google, you can look up NET Net Bible, John 1:18. Essentially, though, the issue is that the difference between theos and huios, God and Son, is the differentiation of one letter in the manuscripts, since both words would have been abbreviated with what's called a nomina sacra. Nomina sacra is just a Latin term that means sacred names, and it's a term describing a scribal practice of abbreviating frequently occurring words, names, and titles within the Greek manuscript. So typically, they would either use the first two letters or three, depending on the length of the word, or first and last letters of the word, and create a contraction. So I'll show you right here. I'll just pull this up. You'll see right there is actually the text we're looking at from John 1:18 in P66. You have the reading right there beside it in a modern Greek script. And under there, I've got the difference between God, theos, and huios, Son, in the nomina sacra. So you can see they're very similar. It's the difference between one letter, that first letter. But other than that, it's the line on top and the final sigma. And then you have a theta, and you have the alternate first letter. So you can see how that would change. So a part of the issue is that the majority of manuscripts which come later all say homogenes huios, whereas the use of monogenes theos without the article are found in all of our earliest copies. Like here in P66, here's another example in P75, which is also a 3rd century manuscript. It also has monogenes theos. This is true in a number of other early manuscripts. And there's a lot of debate as to which is authentic. You can go read, say, a big long explanation in the footnotes of the NET Bible, but I personally stick with the likelihood that what P66 here says is original. That John wrote theos, and later scribes either made a scribal error with the nomina sacra or thought that in fact theos was too hard a reading, and homogenes huios, the one and only Son, smoothed the trickiness of that reading out. Now, why would it smooth out the trickiness? Why would that particular thing happen? How would that smooth over the tricky wrinkle? Well, if you look into it, you find that there are actually 8 other uses of the term monogenes. And of those 8 in the New Testament, 4, Luke 7:12, John 3:16, John 3:18, and 1 John 4:9, the phrase function as an attributive adjective modifying the word huios, Son. So at face value, the sentence, no one has ever seen God, it reads rather oddly. However, it makes far more sense that later scribes saw this as a mistake due to the perceived awkwardness of the sentence, and knowing the regular use of monogenes elsewhere in the Gospels, modified huios, Son, and changed it. Because we do have examples of ha monogenes huios, the one and only Son, being used that also explain why monogenes theos, one and only God, doesn't have an article. Then, when it does pop up in the manuscripts as one and only Son, all of a sudden, it does have an article. Let me show you the difference there. So here, once again, P75, 3rd century. Here is GA09, Gregory Aland 09. From the 10th century. And you can see right here that you have the Byzantine reading, homogenes huios. See that in the zoomed out manuscript I have there. There's an article at the beginning, monogenes huios. But if you go back here, monogenes theos does not have that article. Now, what does that mean? Well, what I'm saying here is that a possible explanation as to what's going on here is that the scribes familiar with the phrase elsewhere in the Gospels have translated it here, or sorry, not translated it, they've transplanted it rather here, and like we see it elsewhere, have imported the article in front of monogenes huios when it appears, and that reading of monogenes theos without the article is done away with. So grammatically, it makes more sense to put the article there, monogenes huios, and they've not only changed huios, which I think has happened, they've imported the article, which grammatically makes sense, but it also is what we see elsewhere in the New Testament when we see that phrase. So grammatically, it makes more sense for the scribes to take out theos and put in huios than it does to take out huios, Son, and put in theos, God. Because while it might appear awkward to say no one has ever seen God, the one and only God who is in the bosom of the Father, it isn't incorrect to call the Logos, to call Jesus, the one and only Son. Because he is that. I just think that in this particular case, he's being described directly as theos, as God. Note, both theos, God, and ikenos, he, are what's called anarthrous. That simply means they appear without the article. That's the technical term. If you have a word that appears without the article, we see that at the beginning of John 2, anarche and ha logos, and kai ha logos, and proston theon. So the theon at the end of that sentence of John 1:1 is anarthrous. It doesn't have the article. And that's what you see here as well. I think this is done on purpose by John. I think John is using the anarthrous use, the use without the article, in both theos and ikenos, and that simply means that this is significant because both terms are anarthrous substantives. Well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that the author is drawing attention to the uniqueness of the familial status of Jesus Christ as the one and only, and yet connected with the theon at the beginning of the sentence, along with this phrase of closeness, right, who is in the bosom, it also communicates the relational aspect of the Logos with God the Father. And so the perceived awkward grammar here merely serves to emphasize the theological reality that I think the author is trying to make. So the position of the Logos made flesh the one and only, the unique God, is described by the appositional phrase, who is in the bosom of the Father, which denotes intimacy. Aside from that, the other question is whether monogenes means only begotten or one and only. This is also the word used in the famous John 3:16 passage, right? God so loved the world that he gave his huion ton monogene, his only begotten, or his one of a kind, one and only son. So what's the debate here? Well, the debate is about whether monogenes is a compound word from mono, meaning one or only, and genos, meaning kind. In other words, one of a kind or one and only, or whether it comes from mono, meaning one and only, and genao, which means to beget or to bring forth. So depending on whether we think that word comes where we think that word comes from, we can read that as only begotten or one and only. I tend to fall into the camp to read it one and only. I think the single letter nu, you see right here, which is the Greek letter N, in genos, while genao has two nus, speaks to its origin. So monogenes has one nu, genos has one nu. So if we're looking for an origin of a compound word, I think that, at least at a face value, kind of reveals its meaning. I also see the understanding communicated in other instances. For example, Isaac is described in the Greek translation of the Old Testament as being Abraham's monogenes huios, one and only son. And because Abraham had other birth sons, I think it makes sense to give Isaac special place, that is his one and only sonness, because Isaac did have other begotten sons. That is another place we can look to. And I'm fine with, say, Trinitarian creeds like the Nicene Creed, which describes Jesus as being true God from true God, begotten, not made, because I think theologically there is precedence to still use the only begotten term. I just don't think that that's what the author of John is doing here. Here, I think what's going on is that monogenes is communicating one and only, or one of a kind, not only begotten. Okay, on to the last clause, ekenos exegesato. The choice of the verb exegesato is like an exclamation mark being put on the end of John's prologue. You might know the word exegesis, which is the art of bringing out the meaning of a text. To exegete something is to bring the meaning and intention of the original author out of the text. That's in comparison to, say, eisegesis, which is reading your own interpretation into the text. So proper exegesis, you start with the intention of the original author, and then you read that meaning out of the text. With eisegesis, you start with your own meaning, and you read that into what the original author says. So it's backwards. That word, exegesis, comes from this Greek word, exegesato. So the author of John, you can look here, is saying that this only unique God, which is at the bosom of the Father, he exegetes, he fully brings out, he fully reveals, he entirely illuminates the meaning of the Father. In other words, he has made him. I hope that was helpful. Maybe some things were interesting. Maybe you fell asleep. That's okay. You're forgiven. Go and sin no more. But other than that, thanks for sticking around. If you want to learn more about the Bible, the history of the Bible, Christian apologetics, hit that subscribe button. Make sure you like and share. And until next time, love God, love people.